Well, good morning and welcome to day 2, day 3, depending on how you look at it, of the Texas Tribune Festival. Hope you guys are having a good time. We appreciate you coming out early on this Saturday morning. The panel is from deployment to employment, looking at how to employ veterans in the state, which is a ballooning population here. My name is Alana Rocha. I'm the multimedia reporter here at the Texas Tribune, and on the side, I've kind of covered veterans issues piecemeal over the past 5 years. So with that, I will give you some announcements. The panel is supported by the Texas Tech University System and Zachary, though corporate sponsors and donors underwrite this event. They play no role in determining the panel's content, panelist, or line of questioning. This panel will be 60 minutes. It'll be about 45 minutes of moderated conversation, and then there will be a mic going around the room for audience questions. So I'll give you about a 5-minute warning, and you guys can raise your hands and we'll get a mic to you. If you are using your phones, we just ask you put them on silent, please. And then if you're tweeting, we ask that you use the hashtag TribFest18. And with that, I will get into introductions. Starting at the end, Richard Delgado serves as Director of Military Affairs and ROTC at Texas A&M University, San Antonio. He has for the past 9 years been in that role. He helps facilitate training for faculty and staff on military cultural competence. He also acts as a voice for veterans and their families by serving on numerous state and national panels, committees, and boards. Seated next to him is Jodey Arrington, Texas Congressman who has represented the Lubbock area since 2016. He is one of 2 Texans to serve on House Committee on Veterans Affairs. Prior to his time in Congress, he worked for the Texas Tech University System and as an advisor to then Governor George W. Bush and later to the President in the White House. Seated next to him is Ruth Hughs. Governor Greg Abbott first appointed Ms. Hughs to the Texas Workforce Commission in 2015, and in August of this year, she was named chairwoman. Prior to that, she served in the Texas Attorney General's office as Director of Defense Litigation. And last but not least, I'm seated next to Paul Rieckhoff, founder and chief executive officer of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, America's first and largest organization for Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. From 2003 to 2004, Mr. Rieckhoff served as an Army First Lieutenant and Infantry Rifle Platoon Leader, in Iraq, recognized authority on the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and a broad range of issues. He appears on numerous televisions as that authority. And with that, let's have a round of applause for our panelists, and we'll dive right in.
Thank you, Alana.
So we'll start broad. Give us an overview of what the population of veterans in the state looks like. And I mean, we always hear the 1.7 million figure. We're currently second behind California as far as the largest number of veterans in the state. But I guess tick through some of the numbers to give us an overview of veterans here, if we have a breakdown on how many of them are employed or seeking employment. Ms. Hughs?
Well, you're right, we have about 1.7 million veterans here, second largest population in the country. We're incredibly proud of that, and we want to make sure that when they serve here, they stay here. So we're very excited to promote programs that will assist with that. We have about, I don't want to give you the wrong number, but about 20 to 30,000, somewhere in that range, depending on the year, that actually are out of military service every year and transitioning into civilian life. And the amount of veterans, I mean, nationwide we know it's under 10%, but here in Texas we roughly have about in the 20 to 25,000 maybe they're actually coming out every year. That number keeps changing, so that's my hesitation. And our unemployment rate across the state is very low, including among our veteran population at this time. So I think we're at 3.9%, and that's good, but we also want to make sure it's the right employment. We have some underemployment, underutilized skills, and want to make sure we address that and we give them tools that are needed to really succeed in our society.
Why are veterans marketable? I mean, why should veterans be hired by, Texas is open for business, several companies here. Paul, why are they marketable?
I think it's really a smart business investment. I think the case that we've been making at IAVA for over a decade is that veterans are not a charity, they're an investment. Make an investment in this population, they're going to do some incredible things. Whether it's for your economy, for your university, for your small business, they get things done. And I think especially in times like this, they've shown that they can get things done in incredibly difficult environments. Whether it's Washington, D.C. or starting a small business here in Austin, they have the tenacity, they have the skill set, and they also have the values. which I think is really important. We talk a lot about the values in the military, and right now where it seems like many parts of our country have lost their way, we think that veterans can also be kind of a conscience for America, in the same way our journalists can be. I think we need to help Americans understand what's most important, and we think that veterans can really be a part of the future. So it's a smart move. I think Texas has been ahead of the game in understanding that. I'm not a Texan, so I feel like I'm kind of in the crossfire here, right? But I've been doing this for 15 years now, and you can feel the energy growing, and you can feel the leadership investing and understanding that that's the right way for the state to go. And Richard's a great example. I mean, we've known each other for maybe over a decade now, but he's risen up over the last few years as a local leader who would go to D.C. and come back and take that skill set and just keep grinding and building a movement, really. And there's guys like Perry Jeffrey at TexVet, Jeff Hensley at eQuest nearby. There's just these great leaders that have created kind of a ball that started rolling. And what I tell businesses is get on board, because if you don't, you're missing out. And you're going to have a competitive disadvantage if you don't understand that veterans are the smartest investment you can make right now.
And of course, if they can't find a job, I think we were talking, Richard, if they go, 60, 90 days without finding it, they often end up at a university like yours.
Absolutely. So I think at the overview is that transition is hard for everyone. That transition is finding your next mission. So A&M San Antonio has truly, in my opinion, laid the foundation of truly welcoming them home and providing all those resources, not only in the classroom, but outside. So it has to be systematic, that you're not only providing what's good inside the classroom, but all those additional skills. So when they cross the stage and graduate, they will find that next mission on employment. And the same thing with when they find that job. Ms. Hughs mentioned the underrepresented and the lack of training in some of these, because normally a veteran will take whatever is there, whatever is offered to them right out the gate. And at times that's the underemployment that they're that unfortunately they get into. But with training and the companies really have to, as Paul mentioned, really have to get behind them and invest in them. So once you invest in a veteran, it's going to come back in tenfold. It's just providing that extra support and understanding what they're going through.
And the transition component is huge. I mean, they talk about, I have veterans tell me that going in, you get all this training, and then when you're being released to the civilian world, it's just they cut you loose. Congressman Arrington, talk about that transition and how pivotal that is, and what the piece of legislation you're working on to address that.
Sure. First, let me say it's an honor to be here and on this panel, and I appreciate and respect all of our veterans. It's a great opportunity for me. I didn't serve in the military, to say thank you and to serve those who did serve and make that sacrifice. So thanks, veterans. God bless you guys, and I hope I can make a difference for them. Speaking of, I had a friend in high school, Bill Mulder, who was a highly decorated combat veteran Navy SEAL. And in my transition as a new member of Congress, I reached out to him, and he helped plug me in with another freshman member, Scott Taylor, who served with him as a Navy SEAL. 2 months later, Bill took his life. And this bill, this Transition Assistance Improvement Act, is named in his honor. You couldn't see the scars on Bill. You would never know. He's the toughest, most resilient, most courageous person you would have ever met. That was certainly his reputation in high school, let me put it that way. But like a lot of veterans, he had scars you couldn't see. And I think some of that is the toughest to assess and to engage and to deal with. But I know from just talking to him, there was an element of, what is my new mission? Because he was transitioning out. What is my purpose? What is my value? I mean, what am I going to do? This guy was the top of the top, best of the best in the Navy SEAL elite program. And here he was wondering about what he was going to do back home. I looked at the TAP program, and it was clear the DOD and VA did not coordinate well enough. They were getting to the active duty service member in their transition way too late, 90 days out. So we need to push that way in advance. We need to coordinate better with community veteran organizations. They need that support. They need that sense of community when they are working through these challenges. We needed not a one-size-fits-all that you see oftentimes in government programs. We need individualized tracks. We needed a more comprehensive assessment. Look, some of the challenges with active duty folks in this transition are not education related or workforce training related. There are underlying issues of mental health that we need to make as part of that overall assessment. So there were a number of things that we looked at to improve. I think we could do more, and we will do more. I think Dell, for example, was part of a panel discussion with providing sort of the corporate advice and counsel, and they said, we need to have the VA be more aggressive and proactive in recruiting the HR and talent recruiters in the civilian employment arena, and try to translate those skills that they got in the military to what they're looking for. I think we can be more proactive, and we need to bring these folks onto the bases earlier and more frequently.
And Chairwoman, there are several programs at the state level within your commission that address those different, I mean, isn't there a portal they can go to, enter their skills, and it translates what they could do, or maybe if they should go back to school?
Well, I appreciate so much your comments. It's so well said that we need to make sure we have 1% of our population as a country in active military service, and we need to make sure that we really do promote that if you have served our country, that you need to thrive in our society when you do transition out. It's incredibly important for all of us, and certainly Governor Abbott, that was one of the first priorities that he had as governor, was to make sure that we serve our military, that we do right by them. Certainly charged us to look at best practices across the state and then make sure we do it better in Texas. So that actually led to what is called Texas Operation Welcome Home, and it's an opportunity statewide not to compete with TAP and the wonderful federal programs that are out there, but to make sure if a veteran has identified or a service member has identified that they want to stay in Texas, then we want to make sure they know about our state resources 180 days before separation, and then we had our program 180 days out. We're actually looking to extend that amount of time, and we've put some funding behind that, so we have a Skills for Transition where they can get funding to get certified and move on to their next career path. We have our College Credit for Heroes program where you can translate some of your skills to credits. So if you were a medic, you're not starting, you know, at point one in tech or anywhere else, or A&M, wherever else you may want to go. We also found that the spouses needed support, and they travel and they make the sacrifices along with their families. So certainly we've seen a lot of progress with our military spouse program, which also allows for training and education for spouses that are interested in taking advantage of that. And we created a Texas Transition Alliance. So every quarter we get together with all the military installations in Texas with our local workforce boards. There are 28 workforce boards across the state, one near anyone listening, and they provide services to match you with jobs and match employers with veterans or anyone else looking for work. But employers want to hire veterans. It's just making sure that we make those connections and that we figure out how to get them on this right path, so that in a perfect world in Texas, if you're done on a Friday, you're starting your new career or educational path that Monday. And so we work very hard every day to do that. And I will mention we also have a We Hire Vets program to recognize our employers in Texas that have at least 10% of their workforce military veterans, and we started that a year ago, and it's had tremendous outpouring, lots of people applying and more to apply, and in that wonderful pioneering spirit, employers that don't quite have 10% are working hard to get there. So we're excited about that, and we're going to keep trying to promote those types of programs as a state to also supplement and support what's happening federally as well.
And you all have alluded to it, but part of that transition is almost translation as far as going from civilian or from military to civilian world. Talk about the cultural competency kind of component of this and training people maybe in the civilian world how to talk to veterans or how to, you know,
it's essential. I mean, you've got to speak to an entirely new population, and for us in the military, we're kind of like ambassadors from another planet because we've been gone for the last 15 years, right? And so really, ever since 9/11, it's been said a lot. You know, a lot of the country is watching the Kardashians, and these folks are off to war over and over and over again. Especially if you're in the National Guard and Reserve, there's a degree of unpredictability. So I think we've really got to understand our community and understand the newer veterans are different demographically, politically. 20% of IAVA members are women. That's a dramatic change, and I think a tremendous opportunity to have a positive impact impact on the direction of the leadership in this country, but everything we do has got to be backed up by public policy. And we talked about investment. The investments that have been made on the public policy side have been some of the greatest in American history. The GI Bill. If you want to see the greatest investment to our economy, to our leadership, to our national security, it's the GI Bill. That was a great example. But when I came home in 2004, we had to fight to get a new GI Bill. That didn't happen until 2008. But it was a great example of how it can also be a uniter in politics in a very, very unusual way. We had Senator Jim Webb, a Democrat, and Senator Warner, who was a Republican, both veterans from Virginia, came together to work on the GI Bill. We might be the only people who can get Beto and Ted Cruz to work together on stuff. Right? Like, Beto's on the House Veterans Affairs Committee. We've worked a lot on mental health. Ted Cruz has worked with us on supporting women veterans. This can be a uniting issue. It is also a populist issue, so I think we've all got to guard against empty rhetoric. We talked on the phone, I think, in preparation for this panel. We have a saying at IVA for a long time, babies, puppies, and vets. Everybody loves babies, puppies, and vets. If you're running for office, no offense, sir, any politician, right? Babies, puppies,
Where's
and vets.
a baby
right?
and a puppy?
Baby,
Just right here.
You get a vet with a baby and a puppy. It's like trifecta.
The trifecta.
Right? But it's an incredibly powerful message that we have, and frankly, sometimes it's hijacked, and we have to guard against that. And we've also got to keep people focused on the public policy issues that are most important. The employment issue is actually going in the right direction. If folks are listening or watching, go to iva.org/survey, and you can see that our national membership over the last few years, unemployment, they self-reported was as high as 10%. Now we're down below 6%. So it's trending in the right direction, in part because we've been translating for America. You have companies like some of the ones that are sponsoring this week that understand and are investing in the value of veterans. But we've also got to be aware of what we call camo washing, because there's a lot of companies that want some good PR that aren't really committed to the long term, want to pop out a quick press release and get a high five. But we've got to go beyond just employment and talk about philanthropic investment, because we have to start upstream. We can't talk about employment if we don't talk about education. We can't talk about education if we don't talk about mental health. And we're talking about suicide. Part of my job is to sound the alarm on the suicide crisis, which is now taking 20 veterans a day to suicide. The latest numbers just came out this week from the Department of Veterans Affairs. And the rate for young veterans is going up and higher. The rate for women is 1.8 times the national average for civilian women. This is a very serious public health issue and a national security imperative, because some of those folks are still in the National Guard and Reserve. So we've got to talk about suicide. We've got to talk about recognizing and empowering women vets. We've got to talk about reforming the VA. We're also talking about other issues like burn pits, toxin exposures, which could be our generation's Agent Orange. And we're talking about other areas of innovation, whether it's equine therapy that's happening out at eQuest here in Texas, or if it's medical cannabis, which our membership overwhelmingly supports. And important to note, our membership is politically diverse. They're a political jump ball. The highest rate that we see growth in is independents and unaffiliated. They tend to be, the highest percentage is Republican, Democrats, but there's a strong libertarian core, but they're very independent. And they want people who can get things done, and they want to be part of the solution. So I think that's another thing to watch, is the number of veterans running for Congress this fall. Over 100 post 9/11 veterans. And they're going to help us drive that public policy and hopefully move things forward.
I think it's important, just playing on what Paul said, to note that because I think we're all tired of the political dysfunction and the hyperpartisanship in Washington. I think that's overwhelmingly, even as a new member, Republican and Democrat, we made our theme restoring civility, because we know civility breeds friendships, and friendships are the best way to at least find the opportunities to get common ground, consensus, and solve problems. But let's just look at the facts on bipartisanship in this seemingly chaotic era of politics in our country. We have the highest rate of bipartisan bills that have been passed than we've seen in 20 years, where you have a Republican and Democrats co-sponsor in 10 Congresses. You know who's driving that? The veterans at the VA committee. It's the veterans and the customer that bring us together, where we're not red and blue, we're red, white, and blue. We say that all the time, and it's true. 80 veteran-related reform legislation has passed the House, and almost 30 is law of the land. And we're talking about the largest expansion of the GI Bill in 10 years. We're talking about expanding apprenticeship programs, all about sort of maximizing economic opportunity, choice, making sure it works so we have better health care, Because if that breaks down, it will affect all the things that we're talking about here. VA accountability, on and on and on. 30 laws that have broad sweeping impact on how we deliver on our service to our veterans. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying that we did everything we should, but it's working. It's functioning like the American people, I think, would expect in how we deliver on what we promised our veterans.
We still got to be a watchdog too, because there's been a lot of promises in Washington that haven't panned out. We're still talking about allowing the Department of Defense and Department of Veterans Affairs to have an electronic record-keeping system. They can't act, their computers don't talk to each other, okay? And we've been talking about that since 2008 when many of us stood up with then President Obama to talk about making that happen. So there's a lot of promises that end up making splashy press releases, but the follow-up isn't always there. Even on the GI Bill, right now we've got members who aren't getting GI Bill checks paid on time. The dysfunction of the bureaucracy is still a major problem. So we got to hold them accountable, and it's a great time for folks when they're voting this fall. You know, ask every member of Congress or whoever's running for anything. If you're running for dog catcher, you know, what are you going to do for our veterans, and can we track on your deliverables, not just your promises?
Richard?
Well, and one thing with the military cultural competency training is it's not a cookie cutter approach either. So every institution, every organization is different. So our president, Dr. Mattson, mandates a military cultural competency training that Dr. Casey Kalmbach and the Office of Military Affairs helped create to make just the overall awareness. So part of what I do every day is out there educating and just giving that broader picture of what our students on our campus are going through. So at A&M San Antonio, we're on a mission to get 25% overall student population. Right now we hover around 7, so that's 1 in 6. One thing that we changed how we talk about our veterans is we don't necessarily call them veterans. Yes, they serve, but let's be honest, not everybody associates themselves as a veteran with that title. So we say military community because, as Paul mentioned, it's not only those that put on the uniform, it's also their spouse and their families, and you have to do that holistic approach, not just that one person that puts on the uniform. So to us at A&M, we're striving to do more because we know it's needed, and our leadership has, from the top down, has really engaged in those open conversations to make sure that we're doing more. And again, it should be happening at every college campus, and every corporation and every nonprofit, because at the end of the day, most veterans in our role, and I know Paul very well, as has been noted, he has really helped engage a lot of us into making sure that, one, we have to take care of our own. So that's whether running for office, whether just being a spokesperson out in our local communities to say, hey, you know, raising that flag, hey, what you're saying isn't correct. So this is what's going on. This is how it looks in our city, in our town, in our community. And then take that nationally where policy can change and we can really get behind and support what really needs to change. Because if you're not talking to those stakeholders, to those veterans and family members in the community, in my opinion, it's all for nothing. Because you could be working on an issue that we're 3, 4, 5 years behind the curve because that's not what's happening locally. So Texas has done a great job in making sure that those stakeholders are seated at the table. So I know with IVA, it's always been getting those stakeholders at the table, and we have to do a better job of bringing those. So with businesses and corporations and nonprofits and all the employers across the board that hire, you also have to, in my opinion, get them to the table. Ask them what they're going through. See if the training that they're going through is effective or even efficient in order to better invest in their employee. Because at the end of the day, you want them to do a good job. And veterans are known to put in the extra hours and get the job done. But if you don't give them the tools and the resources, they're going to do whatever their training tells them to do. And it plays into mental health because we're not going to ask for help. So Paul and I were talking in the green room about just taking time to take a breath, because we're not going to do that. We're going to keep fighting and keep going and keep moving until we feel the mission is accomplished. And in today's society, that's tough. It's just to make sure that we're doing all we can.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the intersection of the politics and policy of this. You alluded that it's very politically advantageous to pass bills that benefit the military community, but how much of that leads to red tape and maybe duplication of programs? Do you see that at the state level at all?
At the state level, I think that we have a pretty good system in place, and that we really mostly, in my line of work with stakeholders and make sure that we engage employers. To Richard's point, you all have such a great facility, and we keep hearing that mentoring component is so incredibly important, and so we're really focused a lot on the outreach and on the training. One thing that is also very common is speaking the same language, because certainly in the education sphere you have one language, and workforce you have another, and military speak and acronyms can be very challenging. I was shocked to learn an MRE was my meal when I was at NTC for training. And so it's those types of things that I think are important. We actually have a Skills to Work website where you can type in your MOS or type in what you did, and it'll translate it to sort of plain English. But that's a constant conversation that we need to have, because it does also contribute to making you feel a little bit isolated when you're speaking a language that someone may or may not understand and interpret, and it's a challenge on both sides. So we try to work really closely for employers to really take the time to understand what someone has done and how those skills translate, and to create tools around that. And we find a lot of goodwill and a lot of support on both sides of the aisle. So I'd say that we're doing a pretty good job in Texas with those programs, and not competing in any negative way with respect to our veterans. It really is an area that many of us can agree on, and we just, that's why we hire vets, though. We have that 10% component, because it isn't just hiring someone, it's really investing in retaining them and training them and keeping them, and so we want to set that higher bar.
My perspective, and this goes to Paul's point, as a new member on the VA committee, is the heart of, I think, the challenge and the biggest threat to actually delivering on the promise. Because those pieces of reform legislation are just promises. But if you can't implement them and execute on them, they're no good. I get it. And we have oversight hearings ad nauseum asking, why can't we get this system to work? Why don't we have a enterprise architecture that actually is integrated, where they talk to each other, whether it's medical records or it's disability claims? The disability claims process was 5 years in the rear. You have people disputing their disability status and appealing that, and they're waiting 5 years. Not to mention folks who are waiting for care, who get sicker, some have died. I mean, the bureaucracy is the biggest threat to the veteran, in my view, in my opinion. And I think the VA Accountability Act, this president and this Congress passed that, both Republican and Democrat, and it's been exercised. That is, it is that new authority to remove people who aren't serving the customer and doing their job has been exercised 1,500 times at senior level, mid-level, and lower level folks who are either not doing their job or they're doing something they shouldn't be doing. But it used to take an act of Congress, and I used to serve in an administration. It is so frustrating to have to deal with the poor performers, and you have folks that are willing and who are ready to serve and do their job, and you spend most of your time dealing with these poor performers because you can't get rid of them. And then you've got a unionized workforce at the VA where you have hundreds of VA employees who are hired to do a job to deliver some service to a veteran who spend 100% of their time on union activity. Tens of millions of dollars are spent for somebody who was hired presumably for a need to serve a veteran, and they're spending 100% of their time on union activity. I'm not saying that my legislation, and I'm not trying to oppose unions as a whole, I'm just saying we've got to rein that in. That's part of the bureaucratic dysfunction that disallows that piece of paper that is a promise to be actualized in the life of a veteran, so they have better tools and support for employment and a better quality of life. I think that is the biggest barrier. I really do. I don't think it's partisanship. I don't think it's Beto, Jodey, Ted Cruz. Not with it when it comes to veterans. I think it's a bureaucracy that gets paid whether they serve their customer or not. Not in the private sector. You go out of business, or that customer goes somewhere else and that income stream goes somewhere else. Not at a bureaucracy that's unionized and that is a monopoly, essentially.
But that's the dividing line right now. Like, the honeymoon of nice stuff is over, right? Like, your position is very different from the other side. And veterans, in my view, are often caught in the middle. What's happening right now is a fight for the soul of the VA, the future of the VA. What's it going to look like? Is it going to be more privatized or less privatized? This is right now the most significant expansion of privatization in modern VA history. Now, it's a great experiment. It may work, it may not work. Choice, as an example, was really the biggest move to expand privatization of VA in the modern era, and it's been a mixed bag. You can see what our members say. Some folks say it's great, some folks say it's trash. What happens then is the spin kicks in, and it becomes an ideological fight about your view of government and not necessarily about the practical application of what's happening for veterans. Everything that is wrong with Washington is also happening all around the veteran stuff. Okay, let me tell you one really important point that gets lost. The VA budget that just got assigned and approved is $200 billion. $200 billion.
Isn't it just the biggest behind?
Second behind the Pentagon.
Yeah, right.
In the entire federal government. So just throw $200 billion out there in front of all of Congress and let them fight over it and see what happens, right? And special interests, and unions, and healthcare companies. In my view, they all want a piece. And it's the only area of veteran support that's actually grown over the last few years, because what we're seeing is philanthropy is down, corporate interest is down, individual giving is down, in part because the wars are in the rearview mirror. Some think that the government's got it covered. Some tell me quite bluntly it's too political now, because the White House in particular has really wrapped itself in veterans issues, sometimes in a very productive way to promote awareness, other times to weaponize veterans issues around issues that have been very divisive. So it's a very precarious time, and the veteran service organizations for the most part feel like we're in the crossfire in Baghdad again. And we've got to call BS at times, but we've also got to keep moving things forward in a nonpartisan way to get things done for veterans, and that's actually very, very hard. There was an article in the New York Times, I think it was last summer, that praised the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee for its compromise, for its productivity. Those days are gone, okay? Especially when the election came in. You know, you're going to advocate for one side, Tim Walz is going to advocate for another side. The American Federation of Government Employees is that union, and they're going to say they're vital. So whether it's reform, technology, unions, the philosophy of special interests, all of that is ripping through and around the VA in a way that was similar to what we kind of saw at the Pentagon in years past. They used to talk about the military-industrial complex and all these massive companies and interests that would want a piece of the Pentagon. Well, now there's a veterans industrial complex, and that is also up for grabs, and all citizens have to be protective. The journalists have to be protective of the interest of veterans, because at the end of the day, most of our vets are still not satisfied with where we are. It's not working for them, and they've heard more empty promises than any other population in America, and not just on VA stuff, but on the wars, on the military, on how our families were going to get taken care of. And many folks are doing well, but not enough. And I think this is a very vital time in the next few years to hold everybody accountable, and especially the president, because the president ran on veterans, he talks a good game on the veterans, but it has been crisis at the VA. We had basically 3 VA secretaries just this year alone. Shulkin was fired or quit. Then we had the Ronnie Jackson debacle. You all remember that? That seems like ancient history, right? Remember the Ronnie Jackson debacle?
He's a Texan.
Right? Okay. But that was front page news for like a minute. And then we finally now got Secretary Wilkie, who we hope will bring some order and stability. But imagine any other Fortune 500 company that went through this many, I think we had 8 since 9/11. But imagine that kind of tumult at any university or newspaper or your business. If you had that many leaders in that period of time, what would that mean for morale and for your basic effectiveness? So while everybody's focused on the drama in DC, a lot of this stuff is happening below the surface, and we need watchdogs, we need public advocates, and we need the media to continue to keep an eye on this. One last point I'll make. We talk a big game about supporting veterans, but the Department of Defense just put through a policy change to restrict the GI Bill transferability. While no one was watching, they said, you know what? We want to restrict the length of time you can transfer your GI Bill. If you don't use it, right now you can give it to your kid. And your kid can go to school and you can pass it on. It can have a generational impact. Well, the DOD decided they were going to crawl some of that back. We've delivered a petition to the Secretary of Defense of 50,000 names. We have not gotten a meeting with him yet. Most of the veterans groups have raised that issue. We hope you'll raise it too, sir. But this is a really important issue. There's somebody down there said, you know what, we can save some money. Let's pull back on the GI Bill. And if folks aren't really paying attention, they're going to do it. But instead of paying for one joint strike fighter, invest in this family and invest in retention and recruiting and the message it'll send and the economic impact that will have. But we've got to be paying attention. And there's so much chaos right now. The thing that I'm most worried about is the veterans are actually being lost in the sauce. We're not staying front and center. There's a lot of rhetoric, and we're being weaponized, but the actual deliverables are actually getting left behind because people are just not even taking the time to check or pay attention.
What are you seeing with the GI Bill, Mr. Delgado?
So right now, campuses across the nation right now, we're losing students because the economy is good. So most institutions will see it both ways. However, with our GI Bill and those veterans going and getting their education, we'll constantly see an uptick. To Paul's point, we've seen it firsthand because a veteran and a service member, so let's talk about our active duty servicemen and women, they want to support their family. So if they know, for example, the Air Force mandates you get a degree. Most other branches are now taking heed on that. So the DoD is paying for that degree with tuition assistance. So most veterans think, okay, with a degree, I want to pass that on to my child. So we heard it directly from our students be like, hey, what's A&M San Antonio's standpoint on this? And to Paul's point, to me, it was done overnight in the cover of darkness, for lack of better words, until people started raising the issue. Hey, why are you changing it? What basis did you look at when you make these decisions? And again, to I think the entire panel's point is you have to get our input, not necessarily use it as a metric, but at least ask us what we're doing. So somebody in an office, and again, trying to save overall money, hey, well, we'll cut here. And that's always the case. 9 times out of 10, that's always the case, is it's a money saver. However, now look at the data, what that's causing, especially with my generation, the post 9/11 veterans. That's why the uptick in suicide. So when we get out, well, let's go back. So when we're in service, most of the time, we're never told no. Hey, you need something, run it up, we'll get you training. It's that family atmosphere. When you get out, you're disconnected. Unless you find an organization that's really going to be behind you and you have something to give, then you have that support network in that family. Other than that, it's normally your immediate family. And if your family doesn't know the culture, so it's not with our Vietnam brothers and sisters that everybody knew somebody that served. It's not the case nowadays. In Texas, it's a little different because we have several bases, but if you go up north to a small town, that veteran's not going to know where to go, and they're not going to have the resources that he or she need. And ultimately, they're looking for somebody to say no so they can go at home in the middle of the night and take their own life. And we have seen it here in Texas. So I worked very diligently with IVA to help pass the K Hunt Save Act. Again, to me, it was promises that it was all flashy, but if you look at today where we are with suicide, it's still a work in progress. So we did a great job of elevating where we needed to be, but then look at the data right now. We still have our brothers and sisters taking their own lives at an alarming rate. So we have to make sure that you provide those training and resources. College campuses have to do a better job, in my opinion, of providing those resources and that network, that family atmosphere. So that's why we created the Patriots Casa. We wanted to make sure that we were providing all the tools and resources and making sure that transition and they have that family atmosphere that we're accustomed to in the military, where we can go and go in a classroom. Think about a veteran spending 10 to 15 years and then going into a classroom with a bunch of freshmen. Total mindset is totally different. They're in to get in and get out. And not all freshmen are like that. But for the most part, that's their next thing, where you have very polished individuals that have been around the world in that classroom. And some professors do make the mistake of saying, hey, let me hear your viewpoint on the wars. It's not something you open up in a classroom. That's why military culture competency training to me is vital in a classroom, because you don't open, because now you're putting that veteran in a very tough spot. Regardless of Republican, Democrat, Independent, we're going to tell you how we feel. Bad, indifferent, and sometimes very ugly, because we're going to tell you how we feel and what it means to us. So with that training and making sure that we are doing everything we can. And it's not only happening in the classroom, it could be happening in boardrooms. So we have to make sure that we're providing that wraparound service. And as Paul mentioned, we're done with the lip service across the board. I think, and what we're seeing in DC is slowly trickling down, where I feel that we're getting lost. And our issues aren't up there because the wars are in the rearview mirror.
Well, one thing that's going to put them back in the forefront is the number of candidates who are veterans. I've sat down with plenty of them here in Texas this election season, some that look like they will get to Washington given the makeup of their districts. And what do they say? If you're not at the table, you'll be on the menu. Mm-hmm. So I think having them at the table will maybe reignite that focus. We have about 5 minutes until we start taking audience questions, so just keep that in mind. I'll come to you in a minute. But Chairwoman Hughs, can you give us a sense, and granted veterans are very diverse like all of us, but is there any type of job or industry that, do you have a breakdown of how veterans are employed here in the state?
Sure. We see the healthcare industry, for example, a very good transition there. Logistics, manufacturing, there's a wide array, human resources, and it's kind of going back to that language and translating what those skills are and how we enforce them. In fact, we're having our first on October 10th in Houston. We'll be having a Texas Hires conference of sorts, a forum, so that employers can come and learn more about what to look for in candidates, how to translate the skills, and really have that assistance in hiring veterans, because there's an incredible interest, but it's just making sure we figure out those translations. And then as far as outreach, and Richard was talking about having that exposure to what's available, and it's such a great prevention to have that new mission when you do transition out. Fort Bliss and El Paso, until recently, in the last couple of years, was the only military post where they have our Workforce Solutions Center behind the gates. And so you can see firsthand when you tour that workforce area and they go through the TAP program and they go through our skills training from the state side, that in one room from table to table your spouse can be there, you can be there, you can find out what your options are. Schools come in, employers come in, and they have that community aspect to it where they do feel that it's family oriented, that it's still part of a team, and it really does make a difference to have that one-on-one and to be there on post. And so we've seen that, and we think that more efforts like that, where we kind of get across the street from each other, and cross over and meet up, is really going to help to get us where we need to be in terms of fruitful employment and meaningful and purposeful missions after you've served. And so, for example, and actually in Austin, I have to mention Austin Futures Command, who picked Austin, Texas, and we're very excited about that. But we know that to keep them here, it's the first major reorganization since 1972, and I understand they may not even wear uniforms because they're in a high-rise. They're not behind a gate, and they really are going to be in our community, and we're very excited to have them, but we know that it's going to require having the skilled workforce and the training to keep them here and to keep growing, so very excited for what the future holds on that front.
Yeah, every issue is a veterans issue. Everything happening in this country, whether it is immigration, firearms, the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was a great example because it actually gave, this debate this week actually gave us an opportunity to talk about the prevalence of military sexual trauma. And I'm not making any accusations about who was lying and who wasn't, but we heard from many military sexual trauma survivors this week who said, I have not been getting the support I need, or now I want to tell my story. And that is very much a part of everything that's happening in America. The entire Me Too conversation. We started to have a conversation about women veterans and recognizing and supporting them about 6 months prior to that happening, because our women veterans kept telling us that they didn't feel they were even recognized at the VA, much less supported with specific care or policies. So everything in America is a veterans issue, to include, as a note, 35% of our members work in the government. If there's a government shutdown, 35% of our members are shut down. That's something most people don't think about. If they go into the TSA or they go into any other government agency, they're contractors at the Pentagon. When people were getting furloughed at the Pentagon when they shut the government down, a high percentage of them were veterans. So I urge you to think about that when you're watching the news or you see other panels this week. Every single issue has a veterans component. And as the elections come, sometimes they're going to get weaponized. And you're going to see veterans used as proxies for both parties. right? Like, here's a bunch of veterans that love me, and here's a bunch of veterans that hate my opponent. It's going to happen over and over again, and we're going to try to guard against it, and I would ask you to do the same. Veterans are not a monolith. Anybody who stands up and tells you they speak for all veterans is full of it.
I remember polling some before the 2016 election, and I maybe made 10 calls and got 9 different answers.
Even the national anthem. When we asked our members, if you go to iava.org/anthem, you can see we surveyed our members. And there was a diversity of opinion. Some folks are not watching the NFL anymore. Some folks don't care, and they're going to kneel. But what we heard most of all is they don't think it's a priority issue. They want to talk about suicide. They would rather people remember there's a war happening in Afghanistan that we often call Forgotistan, because our friends are still over there, and that's not getting covered. But there's a massive debate around this NFL protest. I think that's where we can be a conscience. One of my friends has a background in the ministry before he joined the military, and he said, if America is a religion, veterans are the clergy. We are the keepers of the flame. We have a very important role to play in being a conscience for this country, especially when you go into an election year. So look to them. They can be a voice of reason. They can be a bridge builder, but also beware that they can be, weaponized on both sides to prove a point, because they know that they're popular like babies, puppies, and vets, right?
With that, we will take some questions from the audience. One moment, she's bringing around a microphone to you. Right up here. Oh, no, right here. Thank you.
Hi. I want to ask a question about one of the obstacles that a lot of veterans face with reintegration. I spent 6 years in the Air Force as an intelligence analyst. I got out, I went here to UT, and then I went to law school. So 7 years afterwards, right while I'm applying for the bar exam, the Defense Financial and Accounting Services lost all of my receipts from my last deployment. And so they came out of me out of the blue and said, you owe us $16,000. We want it all in lump sum right now, please. And I had to disclose all of this to the Bar Association. They're like, well, you might have committed fraud. You can't sit for the bar exam. It took 2 years, and finally my own congressman making a personal phone call to the director of DFAS and the Air Force Chief of Staff to finally get traction and get it fixed. I eventually ended up getting a full apology, but I'm not like most other veterans. I have a tremendous amount of resources. I went to law school. I know how to work the system. Most veterans do not have anywhere near that kind of support. And I learned a lot. The DFAS has no statute of limitations. They can come after a veteran whenever. The burden of proof is on the veteran to keep all the records, and who keeps records 7 years later from a deployment? When I called to get the receipts from the organization that had them, the woman said, oh yeah, we keep receipts for veterans for this very reason, because they lose the receipts so often, and DFAS does this. So I got saved. But is there any effort on the federal level to reform DFAS as an organization? Because this is happening to thousands of veterans.
Well, Paul, do you want to take that, or you want me to just attempt to?
You're in government, sir.
Well, we're all in this boat.
Yes, sir.
And
Yes,
the boat
sir.
is sinking
Yes, sir.
on the
Yes, sir.
account of
Yes, sir.
a failed
Yes, sir.
bureaucracy. And I'm going to keep banging on that because I believe it. I believe it. And I do think, to Paul's point, there are entrenched interest on all sides. I just want to know what works. I don't care what you call it. I'm not afraid to say the word privatization. People are up there, even Republicans. I'm not. If it works for the veterans, then let's do it. If it doesn't, then let's don't. But what we know isn't working is the current status of the VA. And the IT systems is a great example on all fronts. We talked about record, whether it's record keeping on the medical side or the appeals process or whatever. There hasn't been a CIO, I think, for 2 or 3 years. To your point about filling the boxes, having continuity in leadership, some of that I'll put on the administration. Another part of that I'll put on the Senate's confirmation process and the politicization of that process, not to let the president get his folks in place so they can do their job. And let the people decide after this administration, whether it's a Supreme Court justice or it's a CIO at the VA, if they're qualified and they have good character, confirm them and let them do their job, and then let the people decide if that was sufficient, if they feel like the needle was moving or not. So look, we brought up choice. And on paper, choice, not the Missions Act, which is to improve choice. So we got a reform bill to reform the reform that went in place to give veterans choice when they feel like they're trapped in a VA single-payer system, right? Well, let me give you one small breakdown that within the bureaucracy on just the implementation of the choice. Doctors weren't getting paid.
But they're still not getting paid.
Well, but Mission hasn't. But I hear you. But Mission Act hasn't gone into effect yet. The president has some responsibility in this because he's got to figure out a way to get that agency to do its job. But I'm just saying, if the doctors don't get paid, they're out, because unlike the VA, if they don't make money, they don't cover their overhead, they don't meet a payroll, they're out of business. Not so with the VA. And if they can stay and outlast me or outlast this administration, we'll perpetuate the failed bureaucracy. Now, I don't say that I have all the answers on it, but I think I'll get back to it. I know you think it's a political issue, and it is. It probably was the biggest political issue.
Choice is a political word.
No, I'm talking about
Let's be honest, sir.
Yeah.
Like, choice is a branding effort, okay? Because choice is an idea. If it works well, veterans have choice. If this program doesn't work well, you have no choice.
Exactly.
But yes, but the point is that is spin. To call it choice, it's brilliant.
If it's not choice,
we're going to call it choice. Doesn't that sound great, everybody? Sounds great, right? So does the Mission Act. Sounds great, but we don't know if it's going to work. And we know as the Choice Act is not working in many places. So this is where I would, again, caution being aware of the spin. To answer your question specifically, I don't know what's going on in DFAS reform, but I'll find out and get back to you. In the meantime, we've got a case management program. If you go to iava.org, if you or anybody else listening has any specific issues with your paperwork, with your GI Bill, if you're homeless, if you're in crisis, we're not waiting around for the government, and we're not going to wait around for other nonprofits. It's staffed by veterans, culturally competent family members, they're master's level social workers, and they'll get back to you in 24 hours. We do suicide interventions on Twitter. So we have to be nimble, and I think maybe this makes the case of this entire discussion, which is we're going to figure it out. And there's an old saying in the Army, adapt, improvise, and overcome. That's what I see the community doing for ourselves. While politicians debate over the latest VA bill, which may or may not work, we're going to have to be in the middle to bridge the gap. And it's going to have to be everybody working together to include Congress, to include the universities. Most of all, we got to get you help, man. And that is what you need to be successful, especially when you're high functioning, especially when you're going to law school and you're doing all those things, and you're well enough to sit here. I always compare it with the dude who has a brain injury, okay, and has 3 kids running around, and he or she is trying to figure out just how to survive, and they're dealing with the madness of this paperwork stuff. It just shouldn't have to be that hard. And I would flip it and say, it's not just about like some feel bad for this guy or gal thing. It's a national security imperative. Recruiting numbers are down now, okay? Because they've been hearing that you're having issues. And I'm a father. I'm going to tell my son the real deal about what he signs up for if he decides to choose the military. And so we owe this to our promise to our veterans and to the future veterans to get this right. If government is great and working well, it's the GI Bill. If it's failing and it's terrible, it's the Phoenix VA scandal where folks died on wait lists, right? So it really is, I think, the ultimate political test for a president in particular. Like Trump said he was going to fix the VA. Well, he's the latest guy to say that. Every president comes in and says, I'm going to fix the VA. And every president leaves and the VA is not fixed. And the VA is not fixed right now. If he tells you it is, he's lying, because it's not.
And Paul,
there have been some movements, okay?
Paul,
but I'll ask the population to poll veterans how they feel about it. So I think it's really important, right, to understand that is one of the grandest promise that always happens. It's like, I'm going to clean up Washington. Every politician says it, and they leave in Washington still jacked up. Everybody says, I'm going to fix the VA, and the VA is still jacked up.
Paul, can I make
Please.
a comment on your 2 examples? The GI Bill's working, but the VA health system that you reference is not. One is we basically give the money to...
But it does in many ways. It's some of the most effective mental health care in the country.
But we give the money outside of the VA to more accountable organizations, more nimble organizations, more organizations that are more responsible to the customer, and it works. Whether it's housing,
it doesn't always
or it's
work,
the
though.
GI Bill. Not always,
like
but it works more
so it's like,
often
hey, you might get lucky,
when the
you
money
might not.
is given to an organization outside. It seems to me that there's a systemic issue. Yeah, we want to fix individual cases that are brought before us as members of Congress, whether you're my constituent or not. but there's a system, fundamental brokenness there, and that's what I see the biggest challenge for veterans, getting served. It's not the pieces of paper that make promises, it's having them play out in implementation in a way that serves.
And the question is, will your idea work? We'll see, right? And you know what we're doing? We're rolling the dice on the latest idea from a bunch of politicians from one side or the other on whether or not they're going to save people from suicide. That's what we're doing. We're saying, you know what? This latest bill, they're going to sign it in front of the White House, and they're going to make a big deal out of it. It is veterans' issues of the world of empty political promises.
You think having more veterans in Washington will help with that?
I hope so, but I don't want to undermine my own point. I don't know. Yeah. I hope so. I hope so, but I don't know. They may actually end up being more partisan because they're proxies for a very dysfunctional political system. I think in general that they have shown to do that. They come together because they have a common experience, because they know they care about the country's best interest. I've been a supporter of a group called With Honor that is supporting veterans from both sides being elected to Congress, and part of what you have to do to get a With Honor endorsement is promise to co-sponsor a piece of legislation with someone from the other side. So, you know, having a beer and talking about your time in Iraq together may be what creates a friendship or at least a level of respect that moves things forward, and I think that's going to be really important. I will tell you one thing, they're bringing energy. And I think that there is a group of them especially that are less partisan than most folks in Washington, and they want to get things done. If there was an independent veterans party, they would be very popular. A lot of veterans would go there and they would just want to serve. I think they want to find a way to make an impact in Washington but not get it all over them, right? And part of the mess in Washington is actually what's discouraging them. Some of the best veterans are not running for office, and that's a problem for America because we need them there.
So one thing I would challenge you, so I know it's not only your issue because I've seen it firsthand in what I do every day. So I would challenge you to use your voice in a very proactive way. And because you said you had the resources. So think about what Paul mentioned. So there's your brothers and your sisters that are going through the same thing and may not have the resources or the capability to do what you did. So make sure you don't let the mantle fall to the side because your issue was corrected. Make sure that you bring a voice and continue to strive to make that change. That's the only way we're going to make a difference, from me to you. That's why I sit on this stage, because I want to make sure that while I have the capabilities and the resource and the voice to make sure that I am screaming at the top of my lungs to get things done, I need your help to do the same. We'll have politicians go through it all day long. We'll have our leaders who we value very much speaking on behalf of us, but it's not until you and I get up on stage or in front of a crowd to say, hey, this is one issue that I want to solve. How are you going to help me do it? And that's how we hold their feet to the fire.
Brian Mast is a veteran,
Real quick,
highly decorated veteran.
Just have a couple minutes.
General Jack Bergman, by the way, is a veteran. And I think they share my belief. I don't think they're politicians. I think they're veterans and Americans first. And I think they have the same passion. And I think if they were here, they'd say, it's wrong that he has to get a member of Congress to solve his problem. That is so fundamentally broken that this guy is not treated like a customer because they don't have to. And I think that's a problem. Yeah. I think the fact that your organization
Washington's great at saying this is a problem. They're not great at fixing it. And that both sides, you know, Tulsa Gabbard is a veteran too, and she has a different view than Brian Mast does. Like this happens over and over again, and we actually got them together on a piece of legislation for burn pits because that's the one thing we could get them together. So you got a Republican and a Democrat. They're both rising stars. Maybe they'll both run for president one day, but they agree on burn pits. So I think that can be the silver lining, but there's also still a lot of frustrating stuff that I would urge you to beware the promises.
Chairwoman, I'll give you the final word. We're out of time.
I wanted to add for Texans in the room that the Texas Veterans Leadership Program is also available to serve veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. If you call that number or reach out to them, they will reach out to you. You can always call my office. I'll make sure you get personally connected if you need any help, in addition to IAVA and all the other wonderful programs and resources. A lot of it is we're trying to reach out. We need to make sure you all reach out so we can keep that conversation going and really have a successful deployment to employment. So thank you.
And we're tweeting out resources. We'll co-tweet them. We'll tag Trib 18 with them. Trib Fest 18 with them. But there are a lot of resources, local and national. So if you want to share them with your friends or folks who are listening later, those resources are very important. And they're not just government resources. There are many community-based nonprofits and schools and individual veterans who will be there for you.
Well, thank you very much. That is all the time we have. Let's have a round of applause for our panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.